It starts small. A comment about the dishes that were not done. A tone that was sharper than it needed to be. A sigh that carried more weight than a sigh should. And then something else, something harder, a raised voice, a slammed door, a silence so thick it has its own sound. And in the corner of the room, in the bouncer, in the cot, on the play mat, the baby. Who cannot walk yet. Who cannot talk yet. Who cannot understand a single word being said. And so we tell ourselves the thing that feels true and lets us breathe again. They are too young to understand. They will not remember this. They are fine. Here's what I need to tell you today, gently but clearly and without flinching. That story, the one we tell ourselves so we can keep going, is only partially true. And the part that is not true is the part that matters most. Your baby cannot understand your words. That is correct. But understanding language and processing emotional experience are two entirely different neurological functions. And the second one is fully operational from the moment your baby is born. In fact, researchers now know that some aspects of emotional processing begin before birth. Inside the womb. In the third trimester. A baby's developing nervous system is already tuning itself to the emotional environment of its mother's body, her cortisol levels, her heart rate, the chemical signals of her stress response. By the time your baby arrives in the world and lies in that bouncer watching you and your partner move through an argument, their brain is not a blank slate waiting for language to begin processing experience. It is already an extraordinarily sensitive instrument. Picking up everything. Recording everything. Being shaped by everything. And what the last 30 years of developmental neuroscience has discovered about what happens inside a baby's brain during parental conflict, and what it means for who that child becomes, is something every parent deserves to know. Not to feel guilty. Not to feel like they are failing. But because understanding this changes things. And changing things, even small things, even one thing, is one of the most powerful acts of love a parent can offer their child. Let us go deep. To understand what happens to a baby's brain during an argument, we first need to understand something about how the infant brain is built. Because most of us carry a mental model of infant development that is, frankly, decades out of date. The old model went something like this. A baby is born relatively simple. Mostly instinct. Mostly reflex. The brain develops gradually over years and eventually becomes complex enough to process sophisticated experiences like emotions, relationships, and social dynamics. That model is wrong. And modern neuroscience has made it definitively, unambiguously wrong. What we now know, from brain imaging technology that did not exist a generation ago, is that the infant brain is not a simple organ waiting to become complex. It is one of the most active, most rapidly developing, most environmentally sensitive organs in the known universe. In the first 3 years of life, the human brain forms approximately 1 million new neural connections every single second. 1 million. Per second. And every single one of those connections is being shaped by experience. By environment. By the emotional texture of the world the baby lives in. Researchers at Harvard's Center on the Developing Child describe this as the serve and return process. A baby reaches out, with a look, a sound, a gesture, a cry, and the environment responds. Or does not respond. And the brain builds itself around the pattern of those interactions, one connection at a time. What this means is that your home is not just where your baby lives. It is the primary input shaping the architecture of their developing brain. Every interaction. Every tone of voice. Every emotional atmosphere. Is literally, structurally, building or inhibiting the neural connections that will determine how this child regulates emotion, forms relationships, and responds to stress for the rest of their life. Now, into this extraordinarily sensitive, rapidly developing, experience-hungry brain, introduce conflict. Not catastrophic conflict necessarily. Just the ordinary kind. The kind that happens in almost every home with a new baby. The exhaustion-fueled sharpness. The resentment that creeps in around 3 a.m. The argument about nothing that is really about everything. And what happens inside that tiny developing brain is something that every parent, if they truly understood it, would find impossible to ignore. The part of the brain most relevant to this conversation is the amygdala. The amygdala is a small almond-shaped structure deep inside the brain. It is the brain's primary threat detection system. Its job, reduced to its most essential function, is to scan the environment constantly for signs of danger and trigger an immediate physiological response when it finds one. And here is the critical piece of information. The amygdala is one of the earliest brain structures to develop in utero. It is functional before birth. And in infancy, it is extraordinarily sensitive, far more sensitive than it will be at any other point in a person's life. This means your baby's brain is running a constant threat assessment of the emotional environment around them. Not consciously. Not deliberately. But automatically, continuously, and completely beyond their control. And what does the amygdala use to make its threat assessment? Not words. Words come much later, processed by the prefrontal cortex, which will not be meaningfully online for another 2 to 3 years at minimum. The amygdala uses sound, tone, prosody, the musical quality of human speech, facial expression, body language, the pace and rhythm of movement in the room, the physiological signals of the people it is most bonded to, their heart rate, their breathing, the tension in their muscles. In other words, the amygdala reads emotion directly. Underneath language. Before language. Independent of language entirely. A landmark study from the University of Oregon, led by researcher Alice Meltzer-Brody and later built upon by neuroscientist Megan Gunnar, used functional MRI imaging to observe infant brain activity in response to different vocal tones. What they found was unambiguous. When infants heard angry vocal tones, even in a language they had never encountered, even when the words were entirely meaningless, their amygdala activated. Their cortisol spiked. Their heart rate increased. Their nervous systems entered a state of heightened vigilance and threat response. Not because they understood what was being said, but because the emotional content of the sound was processed directly, immediately, and involuntarily. Your baby does not hear your argument the way you hear it. They do not follow the logic. They do not understand the content. They do not know what the dishes or the money or the difficult week has to do with anything. What they hear is the emotional signal embedded in the argument. And that signal, anger, fear, tension, unpredictability, is processed by a threat detection system that has one job and does it with total efficiency. The environment is not safe. Prepare the body to respond. And the body responds. Cortisol rises. Heart rate elevates. Breathing shallows. The nervous system shifts from its resting state into a state of biological alert. In an adult, this response resolves relatively quickly when the threat passes. The prefrontal cortex, the rational, regulating part of the brain, steps in and says, "This is not actually dangerous, stand down." But in an infant, the prefrontal cortex is not yet capable of performing that function. It will not be, for years. Which means the stress response, once triggered, cannot be internally regulated. It must be externally resolved, by a trusted caregiver who provides the physical and emotional signals that tell the nervous system the threat has passed. But here is the problem. When the argument is between the two primary caregivers, the two people the baby most relies on for that external regulation, the very people the baby needs to resolve the stress response are the ones generating it. And the baby is alone with that. In the 1990s, a developmental psychologist named Mark Cummings at the University of Notre Dame began a series of studies that would become some of the most cited research in the field of early childhood development. Cummings was interested in a specific question: what is the effect of interparental conflict between parents, on child development? Not abuse. Not violence. Everyday conflict. The kind that happens in ordinary homes between ordinary people who love each other and are simply exhausted and overwhelmed and human. What he found, across study after study, spanning more than 2 decades of research, was both clear and sobering. Children who were regularly exposed to unresolved interparental conflict, even conflict that was not directed at them, even conflict that took place in another room, even conflict that the children were technically too young to understand, showed measurable and consistent differences in their stress response systems, their emotional regulation abilities and their social development compared to children raised in lower conflict homes. The differences showed up in cortisol levels, in sleep patterns, in how children responded to minor frustrations, in how they formed friendships, in how they behaved in school, in how they managed their own emotions years later. And one of the most striking findings was this: the age at which exposure began mattered enormously. The younger the child, the more significant the impact. Infants, babies under 12 months, showed some of the strongest physiological responses to parental conflict of any age group studied. Not because they were more fragile in some vague sense, but because their stress response systems were at their most plastic, their most sensitive and their most formative during this period. The brain that is building itself at the fastest rate is also the brain that is most profoundly shaped by its environment. A follow-up study from Cardiff University examined a large group of children from infancy to age 17. Children who had been exposed to frequent, unresolved conflict in their first 2 years of life showed measurable differences in the structure and sensitivity of their stress response systems compared to children raised in lower conflict environments, and those differences were still visible and measurable at 17 years old. 17. Not because those children had been permanently broken, but because the early environment had calibrated their stress response systems in a particular way. Their nervous systems had learned to be vigilant, to expect unpredictability, to stay alert. Because in the environment they were formed in, that alertness had been necessary for survival. And a nervous system that has learned to be always alert, always watching, always prepared for the emotional ground to shift, that nervous system does not easily unlearn it. I want to step back from the infant research for a moment, because this video is for parents at every stage. And the impact of parental conflict on a child's developing brain does not stop at 12 months. It evolves. It changes in character as the child grows. And at every stage, it leaves a mark worth understanding. For toddlers between 1 and 3 years, the impact of parental conflict shifts from purely physiological to something more complex. Toddlers are in the process of developing what researchers call emotional schemas, internal mental models of how emotions work, what causes them, what resolves them, and what they mean about relationships and safety. When a toddler witnesses repeated unresolved conflict between their parents, they are not just experiencing a stress response. They are building a schema, a template, a working model that says, this is what relationships look like. This is what happens when people disagree. This is how adults manage, or fail to manage, difficult emotions. Research from the University of Rochester found that toddlers exposed to frequent interparental conflict showed significantly higher rates of aggressive behavior with peers, more difficulty with emotional regulation during frustrating tasks, and greater anxiety in new social situations, not because they were poorly behaved children, but because their internal model of how emotional situations resolve had been built in an environment where resolution was unpredictable or absent. For children between 3 and 7 years, the developmental stakes shift again. Children this age are in what psychologists call the theory of mind stage, the period in which they are actively working out that other people have internal mental states, feelings, motivations, and perspectives that differ from their own. A child in this stage is also a child who is old enough to understand that something is wrong, but not yet old enough to understand what or why. They can read the emotional temperature of a room with startling accuracy. They can feel the tension before a word is spoken. They know, in their body, that something is not right. But they do not have the cognitive framework to make sense of it. And without a framework to make sense of it, children this age frequently do the thing that is most painful for parents to discover. They assume it is about them. Research consistently shows that children between 3 and 7 are significantly more likely to attribute parental conflict to their own behavior than older children or adults are. They see their parents in distress and their developing minds, working with limited information and an egocentric understanding of causality, arrive at the explanation that is most available to them. I did something wrong. This is my fault. If I am very good, very quiet, very helpful, maybe this will stop. This is the architecture of anxiety being built in real time. Not through neglect or cruelty. Through ordinary, human, exhaustive conflict, observed by a child who loves their parents completely and cannot yet understand that adult problems are not caused by children. For older children and adolescents, the research tells yet another story. By this stage, children are old enough to understand the content of the argument. Old enough to take sides. Old enough to feel loyalty conflicts, to worry about the stability of the family, to begin asking themselves questions that no child should have to carry alone. A longitudinal study from the University of Michigan followed children from early childhood into adolescence and found that the quality of the interparental relationship was one of the strongest predictors of adolescent mental health outcomes, more predictive, in many cases, than the individual quality of the parent-child relationship itself. In other words, how you and your partner treat each other in front of your children shapes your children's mental health more powerfully than almost anything else you do as a parent. That is not said to terrify. It is said because it is true. And because truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is where change begins. Here is where I need to add something essential. Because if I have been building a picture that suggests all conflict is equally damaging, that is not accurate. And accuracy matters here. Not all conflict is the same. And the research on this is both clear and, in important ways, genuinely reassuring. Mark Cummings, whose work we looked at earlier, spent years after his initial studies trying to understand exactly which kinds of conflict were most damaging to children, and which were not. What he found was illuminating. The conflicts that cause the most lasting harm to children are not necessarily the loudest or the most intense. They are the ones that share three specific characteristics. The first is hostility. Conflict that involves contempt, name-calling, deliberate cruelty, or personal attacks, conflict in which the goal shifts from resolving a problem to hurting a person, registers in a child's nervous system as qualitatively different from heated disagreement. The emotional signal is sharper, more threatening and more destabilizing. The second is physical intimidation. Any conflict that involves aggressive physical behavior, throwing objects, blocking exits, grabbing, any form of physical aggression, activates a child's threat response at the highest level. The body interprets this as danger that is immediate and real, and responds accordingly. The third, and this is the one that surprises most people, is lack of resolution. Cummings' research found that children who witnessed conflict that was resolved, where they could observe their parents disagree, become heated, and then work through it, apologize, repair and reconnect, showed significantly lower stress responses than children who witnessed conflict that simply ended. That stopped without resolution. Where the tension dropped from the air but nothing was repaired, nothing was named, nothing was closed. Children, it turns out, are not just watching the argument. They are watching the aftermath. They are looking for evidence that the relationship is intact. That the people they depend on can disagree and still love each other. That rupture does not mean permanent damage. And when they see repair, when they witness their parents genuinely make it right with each other, something important happens inside them. They learn that conflict is survivable. That relationships can hold tension and not break. That love is not fragile. That repair is possible. This is one of the most important things a child can learn. And they learn it not from being told. They learn it from watching. I want to be honest with you about something before we get to the practical part of this conversation. No one is asking you not to have conflict. Conflict is not a sign of a broken relationship. It is a sign of two human beings with different needs, different fears, different histories, and different exhaustion levels trying to build a life together while also keeping a small person alive. Conflict is inevitable. It is normal. And expecting it not to happen is not realistic or fair to yourself or your partner. What the research is asking, what the science is quietly and consistently requesting, is something more specific than that. It is asking you to become more intentional about three things. The first is where conflict happens. Not every disagreement needs to happen in the same room as your child. Some arguments can wait. Some conversations are better had after bedtime, in the car alone, on a walk without the buggy. Not because conflict must be hidden, children benefit from seeing that adults disagree, but because there is a difference between a child witnessing a heated, unresolved argument and a child witnessing a firm but managed disagreement. The second is how conflict sounds. Research from John Gottman's laboratory identified what he called the 4 horsemen, 4 communication patterns that predict relationship breakdown with striking accuracy. Contempt, criticism, defensiveness, and stonewalling. What matters for this conversation is not just what they do to your relationship but what they do to your child's nervous system when observed. Contempt in particular, the eye roll, the dismissive tone, the comment designed to diminish, registers in a child's brain as the most threatening form of interparental conflict. Not because it is the loudest, but because it signals something more frightening than anger. It signals that one parent does not respect the other. And a child whose security depends completely on both of those people finds that signal deeply destabilizing. Disagreeing more carefully, not perfectly, not without heat, but without contempt, is one of the highest impact changes a parent can make. Not for the relationship alone. For the child. The third, and arguably the most important, is what happens after. Resolution is not optional for children's sake. Not because you must always fully resolve every disagreement before you sleep, but because your child needs to see or sense that repair happened. This does not require a formal conversation. It does not require explaining adult problems to a toddler. It requires that the tension lifts. That warmth returns to the room. That you and your partner are visibly, physically, emotionally okay with each other again. A hug in the kitchen that your toddler can see. A moment of laughter that returns to the house. The sound of normal conversation resuming. These are not small things. They are the evidence your child's nervous system is looking for. The signal that says, the threat has passed, the relationship held, we are safe. And they are, quite literally, the experiences that build a child's capacity to trust that love survives difficulty. I want to come back to where we started, the story we tell ourselves. They are too young to understand. They will not remember. They are fine. I do not want to take that story away from you entirely. Because some version of it is true. Children are resilient. The human capacity for healing and adaptation is extraordinary. And a child raised with love, in a home where conflict exists but repair also exists, does not emerge broken. But I do want to offer you a more complete version. One that sits alongside the reassurance without replacing the truth. Your baby cannot understand your words. But their brain is not waiting for language to begin its work. It is already deeply, continuously, biologically tuned to the emotional environment around them. Every moment of anger that fills the room is processed. Every moment of repair is also processed. Every moment of warmth that follows difficulty is recorded and built upon. Your child is not a passive observer of your relationship. They are a participant in it. Their nervous system is in constant conversation with the emotional atmosphere you create together. And that is not a burden. It is an invitation. An invitation to take seriously, not just the moments when you are directly parenting your child, feeding them, holding them, playing with them, but the moments when you are simply being in relationship in front of them. The way you speak to your partner when you are tired. The way you repair after you get it wrong. The way you choose, in small ordinary moments, to be kind when you could be sharp, to reach toward each other when you could pull away. These are not small things. They are the things your child's developing brain is building itself around, one day at a time. You do not need to be perfect. The research does not ask for perfect. Edtronic's work reminds us that even in the healthiest relationships, parents and children, and partners, are only in sync with each other about 30% of the time. The other 70% is misattunement and repair. It is the repair that teaches. It is the repair that heals. It is the repair that shows your child, in the only language their developing brain can truly read, that love is not just a feeling. It is something you do. Again and again and again. If this video gave you something today, something to think about, something to take back to your partner, something that reframed a moment you have been carrying, subscribe to Nurture Nest. Every week we go exactly this deep. Into the science, into the honest conversations, into the things that actually matter about raising children and taking care of yourself while you do it. And leave a comment below. Did you grow up in a high-conflict home? Or are you navigating this right now as a parent? I read every single one. And this is a space where the real conversations are always welcome.